Airports are meant to be places of connection, but sometimes they become the stage for shocking moments no one could have imagined. On what was supposed to be a routine trip, a confident black woman walked into the terminal, ready to board her flight, but instead of being greeted with the usual checks and procedures, she found herself at the center of an unsettling confrontation. Two officers singled her out, questioning her documents with a tone that felt less like security and more like intimidation. What happened next left everyone stunned. The officers took her passport, and in a move that seemed both reckless and humiliating, they burned it right there in front of her. The woman stood frozen, caught between disbelief and outrage. The other passengers gasped, unsure of how to react. The officers smirked, thinking they had put her in her place, unaware of the storm they had just invited upon themselves. What they didn't know was that she wasn't just any traveler passing through. She was the wife of the Attorney General, a man who held far more power than they could ever imagine. In that moment, their arrogant confidence turned into nervous glances. Panic began to creep in, but the damage was already done, and what followed would change everything. The woman tried to steady her breathing as the crowd whispered around her, some recording the scene on their phones. She wasn't just humiliated, she was stranded. Without her passport, there would be no flight, no travel, no way forward. The officers, who moments earlier looked smug, began shifting uneasily as murmurs spread. Something about her calm composure made them second-guess what they had just done. She didn't yell or argue. Instead, she simply stood tall, her silence carrying more weight than any outburst. What the officers couldn't see was the life behind that quiet strength. She had built a career of her own, always supporting her husband while maintaining her independence. Being married to the Attorney General came with its challenges, but it also meant she understood power, respect, and the consequences of reckless actions. These men had no clue who they had crossed. To them, she was just another passenger they thought they could intimidate. To her, this was about dignity and the price they were about to pay for tearing it away. The airport security staff shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension rise. Some passengers whispered that the situation was far from over, and as the officers exchanged nervous glances, the woman finally reached for her phone. Her fingers hovered over the screen for a moment before she dialed. The quiet ring seemed louder than the bustling noise of the airport. Passengers leaned in, sensing that something significant was unfolding. The officers shifted, trying to appear in control, but their uneasy glances betrayed them. One muttered, under his breath, clearly realizing that whatever was coming next could not be good. On the other end of the line, her husband's assistant picked up immediately. The Attorney General was in a high-level meeting, but this call would reach him without delay. The officers didn't yet know it, but every second counted now. While she waited for the call to be patched through, the tension thickened. Some passengers wondered aloud if this was about more than just a burnt passport. Was it racial bias? Was it abuse of power? Or was there something deeper happening behind the scenes at this airport? Meanwhile, another subplot began to unfold. A young man recording the incident posted it online, and within minutes, notifications started popping up on his screen. Strangers were already commenting, sharing, and questioning how such an act could happen in broad daylight at an international terminal. The story was no longer contained to one woman's humiliation, it was spreading far beyond those walls. As her husband's voice finally came through the phone, the entire terminal seemed to pause, waiting to see what would happen next. The Attorney General's voice on the other end was calm, but beneath it was a sharp edge that only those who knew him well could recognize. The woman spoke clearly, explaining what had happened, her tone steady though her heart pounded in her chest. Every word she said carried across the waiting area as curious onlookers leaned closer, phones still raised, recording every detail. The officers, realizing who she was speaking to, froze. Their bravado drained from their faces, replaced by pale unease. One officer tried to interject, insisting it was a misunderstanding, but his words fell flat. The Attorney General's assistant, who had been quietly listening on the line, had already dispatched a team. Word traveled quickly, and within minutes, higher officials were alerted that a serious breach had taken place inside the terminal. The officers exchanged panicked whispers, their earlier confidence collapsing as they imagined the consequences of their actions. The atmosphere in the airport grew heavy. Passengers weren't just spectators anymore, they felt part of a moment that was about to explode into something much bigger. The woman lowered her phone, her gaze fixed firmly on the men who had wronged her. For the first time, they avoided her eyes, shifting uncomfortably as the weight of what they had done closed in. Then, footsteps echoed across the terminal floor, loud, firm, and purposeful. Every head turned, waiting to see who was arriving. And what would happen when the truth finally came crashing down? The firm footsteps grew louder until a group of senior airport officials appeared, flanked by additional security. The crowd hushed, expecting order to be restored, but instead, the tension only deepened. Rather than immediately confronting the two officers, the officials exchanged quick, uneasy glances, almost as if they had something to hide. The woman caught the hesitation instantly. This wasn't just about reckless officers, there was something bigger beneath the surface. Passengers whispered, wondering why the officials looked more nervous than authoritative. Some speculated that the officers hadn't acted alone, that maybe this was part of a larger pattern of misconduct at the airport. The young man who had uploaded the video refreshed his feed and gasped. The clip had gone viral, attracting attention from journalists and activists who were now demanding answers in real time. Phones buzzed across the terminal with notifications. As the story picked up momentum, the woman stood firm, her eyes locked on the officials who now seemed torn between covering for their staff or addressing the disaster head-on. One of the officers muttered that they had orders, but quickly silenced himself when his colleague shot him a warning glare. The weight of his slip only fueled the crowd's curiosity. The officials took a step closer, their voices low, trying to control the situation, but before they could act, another sound cut through the terminal, multiple sirens wailing outside, growing louder by the second. Everyone turned, realizing that whatever was happening was about to escalate far beyond anyone's expectations. The sirens outside drew closer until the sliding doors of the terminal burst open. A convoy of government security officers entered with swift precision, their presence commanding silence across the entire hall. Passengers held their breath, realizing this was no longer just an airport dispute, it had turned into a national scene. A woman remained calm, her eyes fixed on the two officers who had destroyed her passport, while her phone stayed in her hand. The Attorney General still listening on the other end. The security team moved quickly, surrounding the officers and the hesitant airport officials. For the first time, the men who had acted so boldly now looked small, trapped under the weight of accountability. The senior officer tried to defend himself, insisting it was just protocol, but his voice cracked as uniformed agents pressed for answers. The woman didn't need to speak. Her silence had already carried the power of truth. Then came the final twist. As the Attorney General himself entered the terminal, his gaze sweeping the room, everyone straightened. But instead of only demanding justice for his wife, he turned his attention to the senior airport officials. With a steady voice, he revealed that this incident was not isolated. His office had been investigating reports of corruption and abuse within airport security for months. His wife's ordeal had simply exposed what was hidden. Gasps filled the air. The officers were led away, but the larger scandal had just broken open, leaving the crowd stunned at how one reckless act had unraveled something far bigger than anyone imagined. The terminal slowly returned to motion, but the atmosphere was forever changed. Passengers who had witnessed the ordeal spoke in hushed tones, realizing they had just been part of a moment that would make headlines across the country. The woman, though shaken, carried herself with quiet dignity. She knew her story was no longer just her own. It had become a symbol of accountability, of what happens when power is abused in plain sight. Airport officials who had tried to look the other way were now being questioned, their silence exposed as complicity. The viral video continued to spread, and within hours, news outlets were covering the confrontation, calling it a wake-up call for airport security standards and human rights. The young man who had posted the video found himself at the center of interviews, his footage proof of the injustice and the turning point that followed. The Attorney General, while deeply protective of his wife, reminded everyone that this was about more than personal insult. It was about fairness, respect, and the promise that no one, no matter their background, should face humiliation at the hands of authority. The crowd that had once watched in silence now felt empowered, reminded that standing witness to truth can